You probably know. This one.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you doing? Thanks so much for joining us. Good to see so many familiar faces in the room. And I'm Neil Piper. I'm the Executive Director at the Presidential Precinct. And welcome to MWF Live for those who are new to the program. We created MWF Live for Yali Network and Presidential Precinct Network members to have an opportunity to hear from you all, Africa's best and brightest young leaders as you share community challenges, share your aspirations, talk a little bit about your work. And we do this through 1-hour panel discussions each week at our 6 partner sites. And each week we convene where 3 of America's founding fathers talked about rights. And so it's such an inspirational place to be able to host today's panel discussion with you all. And today's MWF Live is on promoting human rights and access to justice in Sub-Saharan Africa. And it's taking place at Montpelier, the home of James Madison. And over the past 5 broadcasts, we've had an average of 6,000 viewers online. So although we have approximately 50 people here in the room today, we have about 6,000 people joining us on live. So I want to thank everyone who is joining us from the Yali Network and from the Presidential Precinct Network. Today we're going to come to you first for questions. And so we get a lot of questions from this network online. And I want to thank Dennis Kernahan for joining us today and moderating today's discussion. Dennis is a board member on the Montpelier board, and so I'm going to turn it over to you, Dennis, to take it from here. So thank you.
Thank you, Neil. So again, I want to add my welcome to the Yali participants. I've had the privilege over the last several years of meeting almost everybody that's been participating in the program. And uniformly, I must say that I've been impressed by the passion and expertise and commitment of the program participants in pursuing in their own nations and at individual risk even, justice, access to justice, and recognition of human rights. Our panelists today that are joining me are no less qualified and have no less expertise and passion than all the other people I've met. So I'm honored to have them discuss the issue of access to justice in Sub-Saharan Africa with you. These, ladies and gentlemen, work at, in my opinion, the intersection of the promise of justice in our national documents and constitutions and the provision of justice, which is a lot of hard work. The provision of justice, essentially, in my mind, suggests that rule of law is more than simply capable constitutional courts and independent judiciary. It's a civic environment that encourages the recognition of justice, abides by that, and as our panelists represent in their individual work, advocates ceaselessly for those people and via non-government organizations, journalism, law practice, etc., advocates on behalf of extending the concept of justice and making it a true form and recognition in each one of our countries. As Madison promised us and reminds us that the ultimate aim of our governmental institutions and structures is the provision of justice. So I'm delighted to have our panelists bring us a variety of expertise and essentially discuss in each one of their nations the concepts as follows: economic justice and gender equality, capacity building to secure substantive rights and at the regional and international level, transitional justice, and criminal justice and accountability. All of these are critical to each one of our societies, and I think we'll see in their work reflections of the ongoing issues in our own constitution and democracy here. So we have a lot to learn from my colleagues here, and without further ado, I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves, the nature of their work, and then speak for about 8 minutes on their particular areas. So, Sally, first to you.
Thank you, Dennis. My name is Sally Hurt, and I'm from South Africa. I'm an attorney there. I worked at a law clinic and strategic litigator called the Legal Resources Center, and I now work as an attorney in the mining program at the Center for Environmental Rights. I'm not going to speak for 8 minutes in total because we really want this to be a conversation. So I'll start off just by talking a bit about some of the experience I've had both at the LRC and the CER, and just challenges to access to justice in South Africa. Our constitution has the right to dignity, and if you look through the Constitutional Court judgments from South Africa, they've never defined what dignity entails, but they have defined what it is not, or what a violation of that right is. And so there's quite a good strategy in defining what a violation of something looks like and not saying exactly what the right entails, because you don't want to limit future judges when they have to stick to an exact definition. I want to do the same when I look at access to justice. And so instead of saying what access to justice is, I'm just going to name a couple of examples of failures of access to justice in South Africa. So the first is the Marikana massacre, which took place in 2012. And it's the single biggest killing of protesters since about 1960 in South Africa. It was mine workers protesting for better working conditions and a better salary. And between August and September of 2012, 41 of them were killed. There's been a commission of inquiry for the Marikana massacre, but there's been no justice, and certainly the families of those victims have not seen justice. No one's been tried for their killing. The second is, yesterday there was an interesting article in The Guardian about the difficulties that environmental activists face worldwide, and that it's one of the most difficult and dangerous professions. And a lot of that tends to happen in South America, but we've also seen that in South Africa. And I'll mention one example, which is the assassination of Bazooka Radebe from Xolobeni. And he was killed in March 2016. He was gunned down in front of his family. The investigation is ongoing. The Legal Resources Center has been assisting in that case, and their clients are the mining activists or the anti-mining activists who live in Xolobeni. And they assisted with an independent forensic investigator who was there to assist the police, but still there has been no one who's charged for that murder. So again, that's a failure of access to justice for Bazooka's family, but also for his community. Then, if we look at hate crimes in South Africa, and this one's quite close to my heart, a study that was released at the end of last year said that 44% of gay women in South Africa know at least one person who has been killed because they're gay. Usually it's a woman. Usually it's not a woman that looks like me. It's usually a black lesbian. So that's, half of the gay women in South Africa know someone else who's been killed because of their sexuality. Another failure of access to justice on that score is the time that it takes for any of those cases to go to court, if they go to court at all. And civil society does rally behind those people, but you have to kind of think of the justice system not only in terms of the courts, but in terms of the ability or willingness of people to investigate or even accept a complaint at the beginning, so at the police station, and what type of prejudice people face when they're reporting crimes at that level. Gender-based violence in South Africa, 42,000 reported rapes per year. Those are the reported ones. I could compare that to the amount of people that are likely to graduate from university in South Africa. There is a quote, and it's not entirely accurate, but it does hit home, that you're more likely to be raped as a woman in South Africa than you are to learn how to read. I'm going to just mention a couple more because I don't want to depress everyone too much with failures of access to justice, but there's a long land claims backlog, and that means that people who are trying to claim land that was taken away from them during apartheid have years and years to wait. A court case was recently won in the Constitutional Court about this, that the land access movement of South Africa. So there are strides that are being made, and there are people who are trying to make a difference when it comes to assisting people in access to justice. But it's a slow process. Another issue that I care very deeply about is refugees and asylum seekers. And on average, it is supposed to take at least 6 months between initial application as an asylum seeker in South Africa until you have had your case finally adjudicated. Usually it takes about 7 years. Then 2 more quick ones. The issue of awaiting trial prisoners. There's a great case that was recently won in the Cape Town High Court, which is about awaiting trial prisoners and trying to ensure that our prisons are not over capacity. That's an ongoing process in terms of the implementation of that order, though. And then one that I am working on at the moment is community-led grievance mechanisms and ensuring that community voice is heard. And this relates to what Dennis said about economic justice. Often when you look at mining companies, they will listen to workers, and they'll listen to business, they'll listen to government, and they'll listen to their shareholders. But they won't listen to their neighbor who has to breathe in their coal dust every day. And so an issue that is quite important in access to justice and doesn't look at the formal court system is how you make sure that voice is heard and amplified in South Africa for those who have historically been marginalized from being able to talk. I'm going to hand over to Tem now so that he can move away from South Africa and talk a bit more about the more regional experience. Tem and I are lucky to share a history of the same master's program, and we both have a great person to thank for that, which is Frans Viljoen, who's really been quite an inspiration for both of us.
Thank you very much, Sally. I think Professor Frans will be incredibly proud to see both of us here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tem Fuh. I am from Cameroon, and I work for the Open Society Initiative for West Africa. We commonly refer to it as OSIWA. OSIWA is a grant-making and advocacy organization that works across 10 countries in West Africa, and we intervene in the areas of governance and rights. Now, Sally has outlined a number of challenges that South Africa faces in terms of access to justice. And a lot of these challenges are also very present in West Africa. But I think I will not want to dwell a lot again on the challenges. I'd rather just go on to speak about what OSIWA as an organization brings as a solution to some of these problems. Although I will, in the meantime, allude to some of the problems and, of course, the solutions that accompany this. Now, across West Africa, we have a very dynamic region, a dynamic and volatile region with so many complexities that make access to justice very, very challenging. We're not only talking about the challenges relating to spatial distribution of courts, we're not only talking about the challenges about time it takes to resolve issues in courts, we're not only talking about the challenges between the synergy between formal and informal justice systems. We're talking about deep-rooted challenges across the whole justice sector. And I want to really focus on the criminal justice system. Criminal justice systems in West Africa are essentially broken. Broken in the sense that there is very minimal coordination between the various actors in the criminal justice chain. And what this leads to is denial of justice at many levels. So there is a lot of arbitrariness on the part of law enforcement. There is a lot of people who go to jail for reasons that are, I don't know how to put that, but they go to prison for all the wrong reasons. They go to prison for petty offenses. They go to prison because they are poor. And OSIWA, as an organization, has devised a strategy to some sort of bring a solution to some of the root causes of these challenges. Now, the first important issue that we work on is the issue of petty offenses. Now, when you look at the statute books of a lot of West African countries, you find a lot of petty offenses that unjustifiably send people to jail. So we have offenses like harboring, offenses like loitering, offenses like offenses that have nothing to do with a person being some sort of a danger to society. What do these offenses do? They clog up the system. So the courts are burdened with this system, and the more important cases cannot be taken care of. So what we've started to do is to start a campaign where we are encouraging states to relook at their statute books and remove some of these offenses. They either declassify them or decriminalize them altogether. So presently we're working in Ghana with an organization called Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, and in Sierra Leone with two organizations, Center for Accountability and Rule of Law and Advocate, where we want to engage in research, be able to look at the statute books of all these countries, determine the offenses that should not be there, and bring about those reforms that will make sure that people don't go to prison simply because they are poor. Because a lot of these petty offenses essentially criminalize poverty. Secondly, because a lot of people are sent to jail for these petty offenses, we think it is time that criminal justice actors begin to look more seriously at non-custodial measures. So I visited a prison in West Africa a few weeks ago before I came here. And in that prison, more than 60% of the prison population was made up of people who had committed minor drug offenses. Not only was that prison overcrowded by more than 100%, but these people, when I talked to some of them, they really didn't represent any danger to society at that point. What they needed was accompaniment. What they needed was a human rights approach to their drug problem, but they have been locked up. And by being locked up, what is happening? We are using tax money, which could go to schools, which could go to healthcare, which could go to other more important amenities to take care of people in prison who ought not to be there in the first place. So another area of intervention that OSIWA thought could help alleviate this problem is to advocate for a human rights approach to the drug problem. I think the war on drugs, which perhaps started here, has spread to West Africa in a very dangerous way, and almost half of our jails are full of people who have committed drug offenses, very minor offenses. And we think that it is very, very important that all these drug laws are reformed to make them human rights compliant. We should rather start rehabilitating some of these people who have a drug problem instead of locking them up and they being a burden on the tax dollar, on the tax francs of our societies. So in terms of criminal justice, those are some of the things. Now, we have had very disturbing cases of people who get lost in the criminal justice system simply because of human error or sometimes because of corruption. So there are situations where you enter a police station, a person is arrested, and his name is put on a blackboard. Now, when that name is wiped off because the blackboard is full, and because all the detainees are coming in, that person has been wiped off from the system. You cannot trace it. So the issue of record keeping, especially in police stations, is very critical to us, because that system, the archaic system that most police stations use, disappears people. And so we think it is important that we begin to introduce at least basic technology in the way we keep records in some of our police stations, in our prisons. And that is a project that we've already started in some of the countries in the region. We're doing this in Senegal, we're doing it in Ghana. And it is essentially going to minimize the risks of human error that leads to untold suffering and injustice in the criminal justice system in most of our countries. I don't think this is only akin to West Africa, it's general across Africa. Now, that is as it relates to the criminal justice system. I also don't want to monopolize the microphone, but I think this is very important to mention. I earlier mentioned that West Africa is a very volatile region, so there's been conflict in this region. And most of the time, when conflict is resolved at the national level, there are still simmering tensions at a very local level. So most of the time, you have to get up every morning and look across the road and see the perpetrator who, during a conflict, murdered your brother or mother or somebody. And you're supposed to live together in the same community. But the reconciliation process or the transition process that has happened at the national level has not taken your situation into account. Out of CIWA, we thought this is actually a risk for recurring conflict. Because if you don't find a mechanism where these people are going to coexist together, then conflict is likely to rebound. And so what we're doing across many of the countries in West Africa that have witnessed conflict is to start confidence-building measures between communities that have experienced conflict. So we organize common activities for perpetrators, victims, and communities that have been torn apart by conflict to come together and re-engage in building social cohesion in their communities. There are a whole ton of issues that I'd like to come back to after. Thank you.
And we're going to pass this on to Chris, who will continue that discussion in a very substantive fashion as well. So, Chris.
Thank you very much. Lucas, I want to say special shout out to Cameroon and all Africans that have been locked up for a very legitimate cause. I would want to say human rights, it's not just a theme to me, but it's life to me. Because I worked as a protection officer in the National Human Rights Commission in Cameroon, but most of all, I am also a lecturer on peace and issues related to human rights. Well, I would want to say Tem has emphasized on maybe the structural issues in a general manner, and I know fellow Cameroonians and Africans that naturally interested to understand what's happening in Cameroon would want to get the details. One of the things which I think tend to be maybe underestimated or sometimes even forgotten, consciously or unconsciously, is that for you to secure access to justice, you need a basic thing which is called awareness. And it is said, ignorance of the law is not forgiven. So I would go by maybe a solutions-based approach, which basically seeks to mainstream human rights from the most basic level, that is beginning maybe from primary schools and even taking it even to tribal areas. Many a time I think the discourse of human rights tends to be very, very sophisticated. And because of this sophisticated approach, the most basic things that we need for access to justice tend to be forgotten. Now, I would want to address the issue of legal literacy. You know, I was very, very moved when I realized that what we were discussing today was on the rule of law. And one of the issues which the lecturer made clear today was the issue of words. Sometimes we forget to understand that the issue of access to justice depends on the perception of justice by the local person. And if we can resonate with regards to the language that he or she understands, then automatically he falls a victim to what is said. Ignorance before the law is punishable. So I also work for an organization called MDDT. And MDDT means the Movement for Democracy, Development, and Transparency. One of the things which we focus in MDDT is to carry out what is called citizenship engagement. That is, we base on awareness creation. And we all know it's no secret that in Africa, the youths now constitute a demographic potential. But I'm very, very afraid, let's not get excited, it's just a potential. We must harness that potential for it to become a dividend. So our organization has taken an approach that is going to enlighten the young people where maybe there is some level of despair with regards to old people. We want to re-engineer or want to engineer this concept of human rights right at the base. And this is what I called the human rights-based approach. Now I'll move to all the things which I think are the most common problems within the criminal justice system. And why the choice of criminal justice system? Because this is the area where fundamentally human rights are protected. And one of the issues which my brother from Cameroon has mentioned is judicial delays. They say justice delayed is justice denied. And Cameroon is a very, very good case study that kind of depicts this issue of justice delayed. Another issue is maybe I would want to use the example of what is going on in Cameroon, because I know it's of not just national interest, but it's of global interest. A lot of people have been detained without due procedure. That is, they were not served with a summons. Maybe I want to use this opportunity to explain briefly what the Cameroonian legal system looks like. The Cameroonian legal system is supposed to be a bi-jural legal system. But unfortunately, events that have unraveled in Cameroon during the past 6 months, and maybe more, has probably revealed something different. This is not just an opportunity for an intellectual discourse, but it's also an opportunity to call the mind of the global community, which sometimes has attracted a substantial level of debate on who exactly is the global community. One of us, which I think is one of yours, Barrister Felix Agbogbala, who has worked for the United Nations for about 9 years in peacekeeping operations in Sudan, in Afghanistan, and now came to give his service in the interest of human rights promotion and protection, is presently under detention. What crime? For militating against violation of constitutional safeguards. And that is why for about 6 months, Bala and others still find themselves behind bars. I give this as a food for thought. Like I said, way beyond just this being an intellectual discussion, it's also an opportunity to draw the attention of the international community that human rights is not just a matter of theory. And my experience in the commission makes me feel like if we do not find a way to bridge this gap between theory and practice, then I'm afraid human rights become a popular refrain, which maybe in the future is going to lose its utility or its importance because people get used to hearing things which are never enforced. And that begs for the question of enforcement, which I know has a national as well as an international repercussion. We all know the way the human rights system functions. For the human rights system to function, it needs the assistance of international enforcement mechanisms. Now my question is, when a state is unwilling or maybe unable, and I know in my case, Cameroon is not unable. Cameroon has some of the finest intellectuals that you can think of. So definitely it's not a problem of being unable to protect its citizens, but I think it's unwilling. Where is the political momentum? Where is the political capital? And most of all, where is the political will to ensure that the rights of each and every citizen are enjoyed? I think for now, talking about the most sensitive issues in Cameroon, that is where we stand. And I would also want to add that with regards to the story of access to justice, sometimes we focus on the process to a point that it obscures the end, which is what we seek for. Focusing on maybe regular court procedures and ignoring traditional justice mechanisms that sometimes might bring a solution to the problem that we all seek might be a little bit elusive or utopic to what we seek to achieve. And that is why I personally believe that access to justice is not something that is designed to be maybe an institutionalized or prescribed method of getting justice for those who seek it. It is much more about a means to an end. And that is why we must all know that access to justice means different things to different people. We must not also forget that access to justice carries an economic imperative, because automatically when we talk about access to justice, we think about the poor person who maybe by virtue of his financial status cannot afford the services of a lawyer, cannot afford maybe the possibility of trying to influence court decisions, as it is the case in some African countries, and to a certain extent my country. And so it brings us back to the old question. Is it governance for the rich against the poor? And if it's governance for the rich against the poor, what exactly are the safeguards which we could use or employ to protect these poor people against vulnerability from the rich? I think for now I'm going to leave it there. As the talk builds on, I'm going to add into so many things.
We're going to now pass this on to Zika, but I must commend the panelists for discussing both the practical realities of access to justice, the in-field work that's necessary to be done, and then the passion that drives it. And so it's not to set you up, Zika, but go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dennis. My name is Dzikamai Bere. I work for the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, which is a coalition of 21 human rights organizations in Zimbabwe. Our main mandate is to combat organized violence and torture. But particularly my work focuses on transitional justice. And it was interesting when I listened to colleagues speaking and I came to the realization that the problems of Africa are basically the same across the continent. And this morning we were working on the rule of law lecture, and it was very interesting when I walked into the lecture and I found on my desk the rule of law index, and I quickly went through the rule of law index looking for Zimbabwe. I found Zimbabwe on the rule of law index, and it's ranked number 118. You can guess out of how many? Out of 118. How many of you were surprised? I was not surprised. And the reason why I was surprised, I'm going to paint the picture for you. Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980. So there was a transition in 1980. And from 1980, we inherited a system that is locked up in violence. It's basically an infrastructure of violence. And one of the things that we have struggled with since 1980 is how do we transform a colonial violent machinery for a new Zimbabwe. And while we were still celebrating the independence, in 1982, we fell into a bloody conflict in which 20,000 people were killed, 20,000 civilians. 1987, then there was the Unit Accord, which claimed to bring the country back together to peace. But in 1998, there were violent food riots in which a number of people were injured, and some of them were killed when the military responded ruthlessly to demonstrations. Then from the year 2000, and I think to 2008, we had a series of violent elections in which a number of people were killed. Significant to point out is 2005, when there was what was called the Operation Cleanup, which displaced over 700,000 people, according to the United Nations. Then we move on to 2008, when Zimbabwe formed the unit government, after a bloody election in which 84 people were killed. The opposition said 200 people were killed. Our members documented 84 people during that election year. So what I'm summarizing is a culture of violence, and what we're trying to deal with is how do we stop this culture of violence. So the transitional justice program that I run is trying to say, how can we as a country come together and put an end to this? And I think these are questions that cut across the continent. All the human rights violations that we have talked about, we then probably are trying to grapple with the question to say, what are the root causes of these challenges, and how can we put an end to this? And one of the mechanisms that we have been pushing for since 2009 is to have a commission. And we have so much to learn from our colleagues in South Africa. And when Sally was talking about the work that they are doing in South Africa, there is so much that we, civil society in Zimbabwe, have to learn from the work that is being done across the border. In fact, when the security situation in Zimbabwe does not allow us to grapple with these issues, we cross over the border. For example, the 2003 symposium, which decided that civil society in Zimbabwe is not going to let the politicians sell justice for the sake of peace. It was held in South Africa. That's why it's called the Johannesburg Symposium. And in 2013, the International Conference on Transitional Justice, which established the National Transitional Justice Working Group, which I coordinate. That conference was held in South Africa again, because there's so much support across the board. So when I hear Tim talking about the capacity building work that they're doing for civil society, and when I hear Sally talking about the work that they're doing in South Africa, and when I hear the challenges that are happening in Cameroon, I can draw these linkages. And I think it's a time that we are beginning to think to say, in Zimbabwe, we are establishing a commission after the world has put about 45 commissions since the first commission in Uganda in 1974. That means we've got so much to learn from what is happening across the board. So currently, the Constitution of Zimbabwe has established what is known as the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. And just as I came to the fellowship, the bill to operationalize that commission was being debated. And the question that we keep asking, and which I think I would be glad to keep engaging with the fellows, is how do we push a government to investigate itself? Right? That is the question of transitional justice without a transition. And I think we will need to learn from our colleagues.
Thank you. So I want to commend the panelists for discussing with us not only the challenges of access to justice, but in each one of their particular talks, the particular passion and expertise they apply to achieving this more broadly. I'd like to open this up to questions for the panelists to further elaborate on any of the issues that they have talked about. So, are there any questions from the audience here? Hey.
I'd like to know how you would each perceive the impact of the colonial past on the issues and problems you described today. Or are there, what other factors are in play? I know economics is part of a tribal legacy in places, or what's the larger background, the deep story?
Sally, you want to start, or move over? There we go.
Thank you very much for that question. Colonialism has got a lot to do with many of these problems. Now, when you look at the criminal justice systems, they are modeled after a system which is very alien to the usages of the people who are supposed to use them. Now, we before the colonial powers came, we had our traditional justice systems that used to function, of course, with their own limitations. Now, we've added another layer, which to my mind is very elitist and is not seen as legitimate by a majority of the people, because they simply don't understand how the system functions. And so you find a situation where people don't identify with a system that they are supposed to use to solve their daily problems. That is one. Secondly, the problems that Chris alluded to, the identity crisis that is happening in Cameroon. is totally colonial. So after the First World War, Cameroon was carved up between France and Britain. Britain administered its own part using its own rules, and France administered it with its own rules. And then at some point we were supposed to come together, but we needed to keep our differences. But of course, we didn't establish a system of government that could use our differences as a springboard for progress. But we've used those differences as a form of marginalization. So it is true, colonialism has got a lot to do with this. But I always don't want to blame all our problems on colonialism. I think that for all of us Africans, it is time we started to take responsibility for the societies we live in. If you look around the world, there's hardly a country that was not colonized at one point or another. And so we shouldn't be using colonialism as an excuse, especially by the government in Africa. They use colonialism a lot as an excuse to abuse the rights of their own people. Now, colonizers abused us. We are self-governing right now. Why don't you make life better for your people? And instead you always blaming the colonizers for this. I think this is a defeatist mentality. I think we need to start looking around us for where the real problems are and start to solve those problems. Because until we assume that these communities, these societies, these countries are ours and ours to make better, we're not going to solve the problem. Blaming others for our problems is not the solution. But of course, others have to realize also that they committed historic injustices and the need to also think of how to repair some of those injustices, because those injustices persist.
I think that I would choose one word as an answer to that, and it's inequality. Zika spoke about an infrastructure of violence, Chris spoke about awareness building, and Tem also mentioned confidence in building measures. And if anything, one of the impacts that one can really see in inequality and in the justice system is administrative violence. You know, we're all used to standing in queues at the bank, at the shops, but what happens when your queue is for something a lot more important? And so there are many people that are waiting in queues for justice, essentially. And those queues can kind of impact on any part of one's life. So I mentioned the asylum seekers and refugees. I mentioned housing. I could also mention, and it's an issue that Landa works on, and that's transgender persons in South Africa and the administrative violence there. The queue that a transgender person has to be in order to obtain surgery is 42 years. That's through the public system. So inequality and administrative violence.
Comments on this end?
Yeah, I will just make a short comment. I think my colleagues captured it very well. What I think I would emphasize is that what we are dealing with across Africa is violence. For me, that's how I summarize the problems. It's structural violence, it's economic violence, it's cultural violence, and in many instances, it manifests itself as direct violence. And it links to colonialism in the sense that we inherited a very violent system, a system that was designed to take care of the minority. So we inherited that system, and our struggle was now how do we transform this system so that it can work for the majority. And that's the challenge that Zimbabwe is basically struggling with. And the question that we keep dealing with is, how do we make sure that the next transition that we will have in Zimbabwe is not as barren as the transition that we had from colonial rule to majority rule? Because we forgot one thing. We thought that slogans are policies, but they're not. Slogans are not policies. There's real work that we need to put in place so that we dismantle the system of violence and build a more peaceful society.
Chris, be surprised.
Well, maybe just a very small addition. I think it's no secret about the root causes some of the conflicts which we have experienced in Africa as colonial. But like I would say, I think Africa has gone beyond bemoaning its past and probably always resting or giving excuses to maybe mere colonialism. I would use maybe one phrase to capture what I want to say. Some might be the cause, but I think all are responsible. So I think together with all the powers, we have to work together to build what was probably lost during the colonial days. That may entail negotiation, that may entail constructive engagement, but most of all, we need a comprehensive framework that is guided by an enlightened self-interest. Because there is no secret that states functions based on interest. And there is the principle of sovereignty that makes international cooperation, especially within the context of intervention, much more complex. So we are compelled to be together to solve at least global issues like climate change, terrorism. And where we feel like one country has hurt the other, we have to find the best ways of addressing it through an enlightened self-interest.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? Tony?
Dennis, I actually had two, but Zika answered one, which was, what are you learning from each other as you go through this process? And you gave a good summary of that as you share and get different experiences. So, Tim, I'll direct my question to you, which is, you raised an interesting point where there are nationalistic issues about implementation. But when you look out your window across the street, you have a problem because there's somebody you don't agree with. Taking the ideas that you're learning, what are you going to take away, and what action are you going to take to build a strategy to start changing Cameroon as you described?
Thank you very much. I think Cameroon is not going to be changed overnight, but Cameroon is definitely going to be changed. Whether we like it or not, Cameroon is going to be changed. Now, for all human rights practitioners across Africa, this is a moment of opportunity. For all change makers across Africa, this is a moment of opportunity. And why is it a moment of opportunity? I think social media makes it a moment of opportunity. Those brutal dictators cannot take away all our phones. Those brutal dictators, they cannot tell us what to say and what not to say. Those brutal dictators cannot stop us from mobilizing the way we want. And for me, this is where the change is going to come. The change is going to come from the young people who now have the tools to mobilize in safety. I know that governments still find a way to make sure that we don't forge ahead. So recently in Cameroon, internet was cut off for 3 months in the Anglophone part of the country, so that the young people could not mobilize to ask for the change that is so overdue. But this change is unstoppable. And the power that we have in our hands as African youth is the power of network. We are here. I have met people from more than 20 different African countries. We have learned about our common problems. And of course, we are devising common strategies to attack some of these problems, because the problems across most of our countries are similar. And I want to just say to the dictators and to those who are stifling progress, your time is up.
Thank you for that response. And as a follow-up to the prior question here, Joseph on Facebook agrees that many of Africa's problems are the same. So what do we do collectively? What are the common solutions? So, yes.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for your question. There are 3 things that I recommend. One of them stems from this particular program, the courage to lead. And it's linked to what Tem said. Young people need to gather that courage and lead. Instead of just demanding solutions, let's gather the courage to rise, lead, and present those solutions. And I think that's the first thing. The second thing that I would want to recommend is, based from the experience of the work that I've been doing in Zimbabwe, I think if we activate participation in governance, it's going to change a lot of things. The reason why dictators thrive is because people relax. We need to make sure that we encourage participation. Then the third one, which I think stems directly from my work, and which I would tell you that is something that I've already been working on and that I'm going to work on and I'm going to accelerate. We need to start the conversation on reconciliation. Most of the conflicts and the violence that is happening across Africa, we're just killing each other. You ask about colonialism, the colonialist is no longer there. There's a new slave owner, our own presidents, they own us. And we need to start that conversation on reconciliation. Currently in Zimbabwe, a bill is being debated at the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. And young people that I work with have been part of this bill. And they want this bill to work because they are ready to start the conversation on healing and reconciliation. But this is not an empty conversation. This is a conversation that must get into the details to say, what are the tools for reconciliation? When Robert Mugabe proclaimed a policy of reconciliation in 1980, many people likened him to Jesus. They didn't know that 2 years later he would kill 20,000 people in Montpelier because it was a slogan. It was not a real conversation. A real conversation on reconciliation springs from the bottom. Let the voices of the victims be heard. What do they expect? And I think for the conversation to take a different direction now, we, the young people, need to be involved in it so that we define the parameters of a real conversation towards a reconciliation.
Chris, do you want to?
I want to comment, first of all, what all my colleagues have said. But I would say it begins first with economic empowerment, because a hungry man is an angry man. It kind of reminds me of the debate, which one comes first, civil and political rights, or maybe economic, social, and cultural rights. But I think from where I come from, economic, social, and cultural rights seem to be more compelling to me. Because, I mean, if you don't put food on the table, you don't want to get lectures on how to vote, how to protect your vote. That's the reality. And that, for me, I think one of the biggest challenges for Africa is bringing the classroom to practice. One of the things which I greatly commend about the YALI program is the ability to see what we see as maybe theories, to see them visibly and challenge them within a very, very physical space. And I think that has to also walk back into our educational systems. Because education, if it should produce real value, it has to be seen to be very, very practical. And still on that score, I think Africans need much more cooperation. The level of volume between trade between Africans is very low. There's no reason why I have to pay a visa fee to go to Equatorial Guinea. That for me is ridiculous. I think we need to start very, very close before thinking even very far. Sometimes I get the feeling that we kind of search for sophisticated solutions when the problems really look very, very basic. The second thing is prioritizing what should go for a national development. Africa does not have technology. Maybe we do not need so many lawyers. A lot of people are talking public policy, but we need someone to create that app that is going to do so many things. Maybe build the infrastructure that is going to connect the roads from farm to market roads. That is actually what we need. I think Africa needs a lot of contextualization, and we have to learn. That is, after maybe ascribing or maybe getting all the very, very sophisticated and sometimes very elegant theories, we have to take a step back and ask ourselves, is this what we really need? I think we need that deep introspection. Lastly, Africa needs to learn how to negotiate. There has been a global relationship, and there is really no, it's just natural. It could have been Africa, the most powerful, and it so happened that the West was most powerful. And the West has extended a hand of fellowship. It is human, to a certain extent, to want to keep power because power is sweet. To promote coexistence, I still go by my theory of enlightened self-interest. Till humanity stops deceiving themselves that they don't have an interest or a stake in whatever philosophy they preach, is just a postponement of war. So for me, the roots of sustainable peace lie in this honest relationship and how we can help each other get better for the interest or for the resources which we all compete for, which many a time are the source of violent conflict.
I'm going to ask Sally to add her perspective on common solutions, and then I think we'll have time for one additional question. Sally?
Thank you, Dennis. It reminded me of a quote from Angela Davis, which is, we have to talk about liberating minds as well as liberating society. And so I think that's a start for what Joseph was asking about on Facebook. The other thing that some of my colleagues here have reminded me of is recognizing leadership where we find it. You know, the YALI program is about civic leadership, but it also has two other streams. There's a public management one and a business and entrepreneurship one. And there are spaces for leadership in all of those. And connecting, which we get to do in Washington later with all of those different streams, is really important in terms of leadership, because if we can find ethical leaders in all three of those sectors, then I think that that's a start in finding common solutions for the whole continent. So that was the one thing. And then the other was just about youth, because YALI is about youth. And often youth is thought of as a ticking time bomb, or this mass, this scary mass, this massive sort of young people that governments are afraid of, and they should be. But we need to recognize the individuals as well, and recognize the really amazing things that individuals are doing across our continents and continents. And then connecting those individuals with other like-minded individuals. And I think that we've got some journalists in our cohort who are really good at that, but I'm sure that, you know, we could all do better in our own disciplines, whether it's law or activism or lecturing.
Thank you.
I think Chris is absolutely correct that you cannot divorce issues like rule of law or human rights from the economic background. And what intrigues me, primarily because I'm interested in Zimbabwe, is that how do you avoid the corruption that has taken place when people in power become extant for a long period of time? And how can young people address those issues and avoid corruption if they want to get involved in elective politics?
So Zika, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much for that question, and I'm glad Godfrey and Kapaluchi are in this room. These are the two young people in our cohort who are already into politics. And the issue that Sally talked about, how do we build ethical leadership? For me, it's transformational, and we were having a discussion on strong institutions, and on to that strong institutions, one of the things that I would add is that we need to build young leadership, but not just leadership, but ethical leadership, so that when they actually get into power, they are not a bomb. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing, which is, of course, refers to my bias towards transitional justice. Since 1980, Zimbabwe has had about 10 major scandals. For each of those scandals, a commission was appointed to investigate. It produced a report with a list of names. Those on that list were at risk of being promoted to a higher ministry. Right. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about impunity. And I think as young people, we need to get head on with it. So I think what is missing is the issue of justice and accountability. We let those people who are bankrupting the state get away, not just get away with it, we actually reward them for doing so. And we let the young people who are trying to get into office, what do we do with them? We only employ them for violence. So that's the third point. In Zimbabwe, and maybe across Africa, and this is a discussion which the panel last week was talking about, young people are useful during elections so that they can sing in the streets, so that they can go and beat up other people who believe in otherwise. And I think this is a challenge that I'm putting to colleagues on the court, and it's something that Godfrey and I have been talking about when we get back to Zimbabwe. How do we make sure that young people get involved at the intersection of education and politics in a way that makes them realize that they are not just the tools for violence, but they've got something to involve into the process? Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, in that case, he'll is over to Neil, but in the first place, I'd like to basically add my thanks to Sally, Tem, Chris, and Zika for bringing such eloquence and passion to a very, very substantive issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis, for moderating today's panel discussion, and thank you to our distinguished panel for all of your insights that you've been able to share with us today. I'd also like to thank everyone here in our audience for joining us today, James Madison's Montpelier and the team that's here supporting us, and what better place to have this conversation than at the home of the father of the U.S. Constitution. And thank you for our viewers online from the YALI Network and the Presidential Precinct Network. We encourage you to continue this dialogue. There's over 500,000 people in the YALI Network now. So we encourage you to go online and share your comments and continue this conversation online. And we ask for you to join us next week at William & Mary. So actually it'll be July 26th at 9 a.m. We'll have an Africa Ideas Summit where all 25 Mandela Washington Fellows at the Presidential Precinct will be talking various topics with TED-style conversations. So that's 1300 UTC time for everyone joining us online. So thank you again, everyone, for being with us today.